Agile Vocalist is a podcast about sound and the performing arts of the California Connection.
This episode features Simone Browne, professional carillonist. Get her bio and episode liner notes at agilevocalist.com.
Thank you, Simone. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks
for having me here in your space. So we met, I guess it's kind of interesting how we met on a bus? No, on Muni going into San Francisco. Mm-hmm. You were going to a game, I was going to a concert.
Yeah.
And I don't remember how we struck up a conversation about Carillon.
I was talking about the Carillon to my brother.
Oh, okay.
And your husband overheard and said what's your connection with the Carillon?
Right.
And I can count on one hand the number of times that people have heard me talking about the Carillon in public and known what it was at all. So he not only knew what it was, he also knew that specific Carillon.
That specific Carillon.
Pretty incredible.
Yes, the UC Berkeley. So as I think about Carillon, it strikes me as it's, you've written a paper on it, which we'll talk about later, but it strikes me that Carillon is like a lighthouse for sound. And the instrument, the players of the instrument are sort of the lighthouse keepers. That's my take on it, but I'd love to hear yours and, how you analogize the profession, what you see it as, because it's not commonly talked about or known. Or...
Well, I don't think that's a bad analogy, the lighthouse keeper. The way I see it, a lighthouse keeper's job is to communicate something, is to put on the light in the lighthouse and say, hey, ships, here's what's up, or hey, city, here's what's happening.
Right.
And so in that way, I think a carillonist is very much like a lighthouse keeper, because everything that we play is a communication to people who are listening. And so, it doesn't always have to be an explicitly political communication. It doesn't always have to be an explicitly targeted communication, but I think you're just putting out music and sounds into the air and into the environment that's around the instrument. And so you really are sending messages and you're sending energy through the air.
Except you get to come down.
We don't live in there anymore. People used to live in the Carillon Tower because Carillon Towers historically were also used to watch for fires, and they were the tallest point in the city, so it was also a very useful watchtower. So
okay.
Even closer analogy than you thought, especially in Western Europe. So be a Carillon in the middle of a medieval fortified city, and the tower would be the lookout point. And then you could use the bells to warn people of something that was about to happen. So that's sort of where the instrument came from originally. It was designed to send kind of simple, practical messages. And now we don't really need bells to tell us when something is happening most of the time. So instead it's more of a community building thing.
Gotten away from the connection with nature and agriculture, and we have electricity and we stay up at night, and now we have things that we do with our brain way past when the sun is set. In that way, a lot of us use alarm clocks. we still wake up to sound. The research that you sent me mentioned that before before it became an instrument, before it became the carillon, it was more bells to regulate life.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any thoughts or anything to share about that?
Yeah. There are people who are more expert in this than I am.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
Because my research areas are more about contemporary Carillon culture,
Mm-hmm.
but I
That's
can say the basics are, originally it was a time mechanism, and even now it still is a time mechanism.
Yes.
We ring the bells at certain times to tell people it's the hour, or it's 15 minutes past the hour, or half an hour, or 45. And a lot of places still do that. One of the most famous and easily recognizable ways that carillons do that is through the Westminster chime, which is the dun 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 dun. Yeah, you know it. We all know it deeply. It's this imported thing from England that has really stuck with it. Like my University of Chicago used that to mark the time. You're not always paying attention when you hear the bells start to toll, and you have to count how many times it has tolled to know what time it is.
Right.
So to get people to start paying attention, carillons, when they were smaller and they were first getting started, would have a melody play for like a few seconds before the actual hour strike started to get people to say like, oh, the bells are going off, I should pay attention so that I know what time it is. And there's a Dutch word for it. It's called the voorslag, like the before the hour strike. And it was like usually a sequence of a few notes. And they started getting longer and more elaborate. And then they became melodies. And then people are like, we could play hymns on this. It was usually attached to a church. We can tell people that Mass is about to start. And so it very much sort of grew in influence beyond just timekeeping or alarm warning, which is what it was.
That's cool. How did you get into this? What happened in your life that drew you to being a carillonist? Carillonist or there was another word, carillonneur, I think?
Yeah, we use carillonist, carillonner. It sort of depends on your personal preference, but both are correct. I discovered the bells when I was in college. I was on campus and I was visiting the University of Chicago, deciding if I wanted to go there. And I took a tour up the bell tower and I saw the carillonist play and I thought it was really cool. And I had no idea that I could do it. I just thought like, well, that's a cool thing that I'll never see again. Which I think is what most people do when they see a carillon for the first time. And then after I'd been at UC Chicago for a year, I found out that students actually could play it. There was an auditions process and there was a way to get into it. And I have been a musician for a long time. I played the cello for quite a while before I played the carillon. And so I really wanted to learn. I took lessons and I got into the carillon and I passed the audition. Thank goodness. And that got me access to the instrument for the next 3 years. And then in that 3-year period, I really got more serious about it. And at the end of that 3-year period, I got my first professional certification.
And so lessons learning, like transition from cello onto an instrument that is as sensitive as a piano, but it's bars. It's almost like watching the same motion with less range of motion as you would see like with a taiko drum. Right, it's almost like
yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's a keyboard instrument, and it's also definitely a percussive instrument, like a drum. And so you have, like any other keyboard instrument, you have this chromatic arrangement of notes that you play, and so we call them batons, the individual keys.
Oh, okay.
They're, like you saw in the video, they look very much like a piano keyboard, but if it were sized up and just much bigger and there's space between them.
So carillons use levers. What did you call that term?
Batons.
The batons.
Batons and pedals. Batons are for the hands and pedals are for the feet.
Pedals. Have you ever performed in a small ensemble where you're one instrument in the tower of a small group where there might be vocals or other instruments?
That is a thing that we call Carillon Plus. Carillon plus another instrument.
Okay.
It's a whole like subfield of Carillon.
Okay.
Okay. I'm trying to think if I've ever personally. I've played duets where there are two of us at the keyboard at the same time.
Okay.
But that's really, we both use the same instrument, so it's not quite an ensemble effect. There's a couple different ways you can do it. You can have the other instruments in the tower with the carillonist, and so you can have them like, if there's enough room, because sometimes we're in this tiny little space.
Right.
But you can have the other instrument in there, and you can have them amplified so that their instrument sound sort of goes out of the tower through speakers, and then the carillon sound carries quite well on its own.
Right.
Or you can have a very loud second instrument or third instrument, like bagpipes, for example.
Okay.
Bagpipes on the ground, and
Okay.
like I guarantee you can always hear bagpipes, even with the carillon playing, so then they can play together in that way. The carillonist can actually hear the bagpipes from in the tower because it's so loud, and the bagpipes can hear the carillon on the ground, so you can do that.
Okay.
Or you can play with a click track, like if you do carillon electronics.
Uh-huh.
So I personally have not done any of these things.
Oh, okay.
But some people do.
That's really cool.
We do them mostly for like big events or celebrations or things that have you have a lot of time to rehearse, and you have a lot of money that you can spend sort of setting that up.
Yeah.
And you have the ability to engage other instruments.
Yeah.
So you can do that. And you can also use brass instruments with carillon pretty easily, because you can have trumpeters and other brass instruments stand on the ramparts of the tower while the carillon is playing. And that's pretty cool too.
I'll bet.
So I've been around all of these things. I don't think I've ever been the person at the keyboard though.
Wow. Okay.
But it is pretty cool.
And then your research that you shared with me is that there are 670 tower carillons around the world.
That sounds
and 30 mobile ones. Can you tell me about what's a mobile carillon?
Yeah. There could be more than 30 now. They're a little bit harder to keep track of because they do move around. So you imagine the room we're sitting in could house a mobile carillon, and the mobile carillon would mostly fill the room.
So it'd be like a food truck, only with sound.
Yeah, it is kind of food. Like sometimes they're on trucks. Like
Right.
sometimes you can load them onto a flatbed truck, and then you can use that to drive it from place to place.
Right.
And I've played several of those. I do not own one. They're quite expensive, even though they're smaller than the tower carillon.
Do
they're
they
still...
have a smaller range of tones?
The bells are smaller generally than what you'd find in a tower, because some of the bells in big carillons are big enough that you could stand inside them, or you can have multiple people standing inside them.
Wow.
And the smaller bells will be, I'm trying to think of a small thing, like the size of a small sports ball would be the smallest bell in a tower usually.
Okay.
A mobile carillon, you would sometimes have fewer bells, so fewer octaves that you can use to play melodies on, and sometimes you would also just have those bells be smaller, so they would transpose up. Yeah, one of the technical ways we describe carillons is to talk about the weight of the biggest bell, which we call the borden. So we'd say, like, the borden of this carillon is, I don't know, like the one at University of Chicago was like 21,000 pounds. It was massive. This bell was like one of the biggest bells ever made that can be played in a tuned way.
And it's cast iron?
They're bronze.
Or they're bronze.
Yeah, they're a special alloy.
Okay.
And bell founding is like a whole thing. That's a whole area of bell arts.
Absolutely.
So we talk about the size of the carillon or the weight of the carillon, often in relation to the biggest bell, because that sort of is your starting point, and then you have smaller bells going up from there that enable you to play a variety of things. But then the big bell is usually the one that strikes the hour. It's the one that's like it's supposed to be like the most impressive sometimes. It's really like the one that gives the root to the carillon.
And is it, I mean, dumb question, but is it the lowest tone?
Yes.
Okay.
It's
all right.
the lowest
Because
it's the biggest bell.
Right.
And so that'll really sort of define the range of the carillon, what the lowest bell is. And so then with a mobile carillon, you'd have a much smaller lowest bell, and therefore a much lighter instrument in general. There are some, if you're interested, you can look into some trailblazers of mobile carillons. There's an act called Cast in Bronze.
Okay.
It was done by Frank Della Penna, who's a big figure in the North American carillon world, and he was one of the first people to take really the first person to take mobile carillon and commercialize it. Like he played at Disneyland or Disney World a bunch, and I think Renaissance fairs.
Yeah.
My personal belief around carillon culture, and this is what I wrote my paper about, is that the more I talked to different people about it, the more I came to really believe that it's less about US versus Europe and more about each particular instrument, because they're really except for mobile carillons, they're very connected to the place that they physically sit.
Yeah.
And so I think you could talk about the Berkeley carillon culture, and that would be the people around Berkeley that have lived or studied near the carillon, and they have a relationship to it. And so that's the Berkeley carillon culture, and that could be totally different from like the there's a Carillon in New York City in Manhattan, which hardly anyone knows about because it's in the middle of Manhattan, and there are so many things in Manhattan that like how would you know? So the culture of that Carillon in Berkeley is very, very different from the one in Riverside Church in New York, because those are completely different environments. And so even though they're both in the U.S., they have a totally different relationship with the public around them.
And so what would be an example of the culture of each if you had to categorize?
Yeah, I personally think there are many ways you can look at an instrument and start to evaluate what is its culture like. And so I played the one in New York kind of briefly. I was only there for a year, and I know that people have heard it and people that live near it can hear it, but that it's often sort of competing with traffic sounds and just the bustle of the city. So I think the one in Berkeley is more present. Like it's easier to hear when it's playing. There are students walking around it all the time instead of driving past it. So I think that makes a difference. If there's pedestrian access around a carillon, then you're really present in the sound of the carillon in the way that you're not if you drive past and you're passing it for 2 seconds. There's a lot about how carillon sound carries that can be very different place to place. In a place with a lot of high buildings versus a place with a bunch of single-story buildings like Berkeley. So that might be something. I'm not the person to talk to about that because I don't know anything about architecture.
That's fine.
But I do know that just, in my experience, the sound really bounces off of walls. And the carillon bells are designed to broadcast the sound outwards rather than straight down. So the sound will spread in each different carillon. How far away you can hear it really depends on what the surrounding landscape is like.
Yeah, right.
So at Berkeley, it's the tallest point of campus.
Right.
And maybe the tallest point in Berkeley? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But if you think about, you could kind of see the Carillon Tower from a lot of places in Berkeley. It is above everything, and the bells really carry out beyond, just right below the tower. I want to say carillon bells don't usually carry more than half a mile. Maybe a mile in very ideal circumstances. But I would have to check. Really depends on what's around it. There was the University of Chicago had this big neo-Gothic tower with the carillon in it. And then there was a big open park right next to it, the Midway. And the sound would really travel across the Midway. So even if you were 3 or 4 blocks south, you could hear the U Chicago Carillon.
That's cool.
Yeah, but the one here, it's newer to me, so I don't know quite how far it carries.
Yeah. How long were you there? How long were you in Ukraine?
I was there about 7 months or 8 months. It was supposed to be longer, but that was when COVID first started.
Wow.
Started messing things up in the world. So I actually went home a few months earlier than I had originally intended to because the Fulbright program was suspended, and so we were all sent home.
Wow.
I plan to go to Ukraine for reasons completely unrelated to carillons.
Okay.
I was doing a Fulbright English teaching assistantship, so I was there to teach English after graduating from college. And when I was 2 months out from leaving the U.S. for Ukraine, I was at the annual meeting of North American Carillonners, as you do, and I ran into a Dutch man who works for a bell foundry in the Netherlands, and we were chatting, and I said I was going to Ukraine, and he said, "Oh, I was just there," and so I wondered why were you in Ukraine? You work at a bell foundry, what are you doing? And he said, "Oh yeah, I just installed some carillons there," and at this point, no one knew about carillons existing in Ukraine. Definitely not in the U.S. Maybe some people in Europe knew about it, but it was really not a well-known thing. And I thought that there weren't any carillons in Ukraine because they weren't listed on any databases. They weren't sort of described anywhere. And so I got in touch with some of the Ukrainian carillon community, the people who were involved with creating those carillons. And then I sort of, through them, got to visit all of them and learn more about how they came to be. So that's what I wrote about in the paper, sort of this, like, completely serendipitous meeting where, you know, this guy that I met happened to mention, like, oh, Ukraine, I was just there. I thought, like, what are the odds of this? Which is how things go sometimes. So, yeah, the development of Ukrainian carillons, I think, is very closely tied to the development of Ukrainian, kind of like Ukrainian national identity, just the concept of Ukraine as an independent nation and as a state that has its own culture and its own identity.
Yeah.
So I think there's a pretty close tie in a lot of situations between where carillons were built or installed in Ukraine and places that are significant for Ukrainian national identity. Several of them are in these really important churches and places that are really significant for Ukrainians, and they're often used to play, like, patriotic songs or religious songs that are really significant, which is quite different from how carillons are used here. And it's also pretty interesting to learn about. It's something that, like, if I had several years and funding, I would love to go learn more about. So I just know, like, the basics on it, which at the time was more than anyone else had written about. So it was a good opportunity for me to explore that.
Yeah, and now we're conducting this interview in September of 23, and there's the carillons get played on February 24th, which is the day that the war started. And I found an article about that, and that they, on February 24th of this year of 23, they played the carillons in hope for peace. It just really struck me the power of that, and, well, the sorrow that I feel around that. Have you been in touch with anyone since the war started in Ukraine who's from your Carillon community? Yeah,
pretty often. I'm also Ukrainian American, and so it's something that's very close to home for me, sort of like a complex relationship between, like, being American and not really having to be involved personally and physically in what's happening, but also, like, having these connections and really caring about what's happening. I wrote an article about this. It's sort of the version of my paper, the long paper that I sent you. It is also an article form that's published by the Guild of Carillonneurs of North America. There are several very interesting ways that carillons have been involved in the war. It's all sort of, carillons are not the priority in the war, so it's difficult to say exactly how strong their role is, but more generally, there's this really important and interesting part of Ukrainian carillon culture that's very different from American carillon culture. I know I said that each carillon has a different culture, but also the location of the carillons in Ukraine, they're being heard by Ukrainian audience exclusively, pretty much. So it's really important to remember that there's a very close tie between just Eastern Orthodoxy in particular, like spirituality, religious sentiment, and the sound of bells. Like, bells are very sacred in Eastern Orthodoxy, and I think they're very commonly just, there's this quote that's like, the bells are the voice of God speaking to us. And so the bells are saying things to us, and they're communicating things, and they have a healing presence, and they're very sacred. So I think that's not quite what we have here. You don't really see bells quite that way all the time. Maybe some people do. But just broadly, it's not quite as strong. So I think that's a really important part of, if you're playing a song about hope or about, like, being brave and standing strong, and you're playing it to this community that really believes that a lot of people believe that bells are this healing power, then there's a lot more significance to that.
As you were talking, the one thing that came up for me was It's a Wonderful Life. And, every time a bell rings, an angel gets its wings. That's like the very Americanized, little sad packaging of what you made,
When I've played carillons in Ukraine, people are so excited about them. I mean, people are pretty excited about carillons everywhere. But the cool thing about some of the ones in Ukraine that is sort of unique to them is that you can really see the player often when they're playing, because some of them have the player in a glass box that's actually at ground level, and the bells are right above.
Oh, okay.
So that means that carillon is extremely loud to the people that are walking by because it's right there.
Right.
And yeah, I think most of them are in open towers, so there's no wall blocking the sound from coming out.
Mm-hmm.
So it means they're very, very present. And I remember people walking past the Carillon in Colomea, which is one of the very newest ones. When I was playing it, everyone could see me through the glass as they were walking by, and people were like stopping, and they were like, "What is this? This is so cool!"
Mm-hmm.
And just like really, really interested in what it was and sort of like what I was doing on it, and like very excited.
Yeah. And that was in Ukraine.
Yeah, that one was in Ukraine.
Yeah.
There's also, I played a mobile carillon in Ukraine, in Kyiv, in the courtyard of St. Sophia's Cathedral, which is like a really, really significant cultural and religious site in Ukraine. And it was really nice weather, and there was a small group of people sort of visiting they were just visiting the cathedral.
Mm-hmm.
And then they also, they heard the carillon, they got really excited, and some kids like climbed up onto the part where I was playing, just like looking at the bells and really enjoying seeing it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think people get really excited when they can see the carillon, and
Yes.
they can because if you hear bells, you might even think it's a computer, or they're not even real bells, or you probably have no idea that this physical action with hands and feet is what's happening. So it's really, people really get excited when they can see what's happening, and then they can connect it with what they're hearing.
What is that physical? I guess it varies instrument to instrument.
Some of them are smooth. Some of them are less smooth. Some of them are like actually unplayable, sadly, if they haven't been maintained properly. Because the keyboard is connected to a series of wires and connections and moving parts, and sometimes metal bars. And so those have to be maintained over the years. And they also have to be designed in such a way that the carillon is enjoyable to play for the player.
Right.
And so that's sort of changed over the history of the instrument, like which technologies are considered the best ways to attach the bells to the keyboard. So that has a lot to do with it. Also, a carillon with heavier bells will almost always be heavier to play than a carillon with smaller, lighter bells.
Okay.
Because it's entirely mechanical. So there's no there's really, for the most part, no pneumatic assistance.
No power steering.
Yeah, exactly. So when this would be, I wish you could see the Berkeley Carillon, because you'd be able to feel the lower bells. We almost exclusively play with our feet, because if you try to depress a baton with your hand, and the clapper you're moving weighs 400 to 600 pounds, it's very heavy, even with like a system designed to help you do that.
Right.
And sometimes you just have to exert a lot of force, and it's hard to do it quickly and precisely. So we usually use our feet, because you can move things that are much heavier with your feet. And also just because then you have 4 limbs instead of 2 that you're working with.
Right.
So yeah, some of them are really heavy. A couple times I've actually been sore after playing.
Wow.
Either like on half of my body only, because this half is the half that's the left half is the half that's dealing with the heavier bass bells. But usually not.
Yeah.
Hopefully they're well maintained enough that that's not the case, but that
Right.
has been the case a few times.
Wow.
As a carillonist, the most valuable part of playing for me is when I really feel like I have been able to connect to people.
Yeah.
So if you hear bells and you think, wow, that sounds really nice, and you hear like a melody, or you're pretty sure that it's a person playing and not a computer, which it probably is, if it's real bells, then you can always try and stick around and try to find the door of the tower and just like hang out there and wait for the person to come down and just tell them like, I was listening and I liked it, because so rarely do I get to interact with the people that were listening unless they know it was me, and then they text me and say like, oh, I heard you playing. But it's really nice. And then sometimes if you're nice, they'll take you up the tower. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Is it sort of a faux pas, would you say, to mix up in places where bells are very sacred, like Ukraine? Is it a faux pas to mix what you're playing with contemporary music the way you have in other places? Or have you not done that?
Well, I think it really depends on the individual carillon and why you're playing. Like if you're playing for a sacred event, if I was asked to play for a sacred event, I would not program contemporary pieces.
Right.
But I think it really depends on both what the player wants to do and also what the community and the person who's brought them there to play expects. So sometimes it could be fun to play something that people have never thought could be on bells. Like I play Katy Perry sometimes, and people say like, I never knew you could do that on bells. And so I think it could be fine. It's something that you always want to be aware of, playing something that's appropriate for because you are putting this sound out into the world, and people listen to it whether or not they really choose to listen to it. So that's kind of up to the administrators of the Carillon and also the player to sort of try and be respectful and also play something that you like. But no one has ever told me, I've never gotten any negative feedback about something that I chose to play, and I play some weird contemporary stuff sometimes, so
Katy Perry, Metallica, what else is weird contemporary? Any punk?
like original Carillon compositions that are sort of written very recently.
Okay.
Some of them can get really spooky and fun and weird.
Interesting.
But I really like some of those. But sometimes when I program a concert, the piece that people oftentimes they like the piece that they know.
Of course.
Like I played like Don McLean piece this summer, and like a lot of people are like, I loved it, like I love that piece, like that was my favorite. But sometimes it's like this piece by a Dutch composer from the 19th century, and everyone's like, I loved that one, and you never know what people are gonna love, so you never know who's listening. So you kind of, my take on that is playing diverse selections so that you can maybe connect with anyone who might be listening. You never know. Especially in places like Berkeley, there's people from all walks of life walking around, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
That was inspiring. Get liner notes, guest photos, subscribe to the newsletter, and more at agilevocalist.com.